The loneliest moment in life is when you have just experienced that which you thought would deliver the ultimate, and it has let you down. The European scene, the North American scene has demonstrated at least one thing, that man's loneliness and hopelessness is only being heightened as his advances continue to impede upon him. He conquered not in spite of the dark mystery of evil, he conquered through it. He conquered not in spite of the dark mystery of evil, he conquered through it. Through the process of suffering, you realize how finite you are and how desperately you need the very presence of God to carry you through. He knows every bit of your DNA like nobody else does, and there's 3.1 billion bits of information, that DNA in you. He knows it all. Where did evil, justice, love, and forgiveness converge? At a moment in history, I said, can I take you to a hill called Calvary and show you the person of Jesus Christ, who shows you the evil in your heart and mine, who was just and the justifier, who loved us so greatly to give himself for us, and who said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. Is there any other worldview that gives you this kind of an answer, except in the Word becoming flesh and dwelling amongst us, full of grace and truth? His name is Jesus. He brings to you the real meaning of what it means to be human. The ultimate answer in the world of Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, Alexander the Great, and every person in this world, the ultimate answer to him is really the person of Jesus Christ. One day we will stand before you, and Lord, I have absolutely no doubt we'll be silent, because everything about you will transcend anything we could say.
Welcome along to the show, a show looking at the life and legacy today of Ravi Zacharias. On the 19th of May, 2020, at the age of 74, Ravi Zacharias passed away only a couple of months after being diagnosed with a rare form of spinal cancer. He was surrounded by family, including his beloved wife, Margie. And during his life, Ravi was instrumental in helping to reinvigorate an intellectually robust response to a pluralistic secular culture and in raising a new generation of Christian thinkers and evangelists. And I'm delighted to be joined on today's show by Amy Orr-Ewing, Senior Vice President with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries and co-director of the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. And Amy had spent some 22 years, I think, working alongside Ravi. Abdu Murray is speaker and another Senior Vice President of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. Former Muslim, his latest book, written with Ravi, Seeing Jesus from the East, a fresh look at history's most influential figure. And Vince Vitale is a Regional Director for the Americas and Director of the Zacharias Institute. And Vince himself journeyed from being skeptic to evangelist while studying at Princeton and Oxford. So welcome along to the show, all three of you. Thank you so much for making some time to share some thoughts and reminisce on Ravi's life and legacy. Let's talk to you first of all, Amy. First of all, we want to talk about Ravi, his life, his illness, some what's happened in recent months. But I'd love to begin by just going right back to your first memory of Ravi, if that's all right, and tell us what it was like, how you bumped into him, and what happened afterwards.
Well, first memory, thank you so much, Justin, by the way, for having us on, and to honour Ravi in this way is just such an amazing blessing. First memory of Ravi was hearing him speak at an event that I'd actually helped to organise with Michael Ramsden in London. We'd never met before, but Michael convinced us that, you know, there's this incredible evangelist and you've got to get everyone from the city together to hear him. And it was an amazing, amazing evening, gathering kind of business people. And at the end of that evening, we went for dinner for an Indian meal. And we had a phenomenal evening just talking and meeting Ravi. I was 22 at the time. I had no idea that conversation would change the trajectory of my life. I just remember a few things about that meal. Lots of theology. I was studying postgraduate theology at the time, and lots of questions kind of thrown at me, very courteously, Ravi style, intermingled with lots of laughter, enjoyment of the food. And I think a real sense that here was a person who loved Jesus with enormous passion, and he was tremendously gifted at calling people to follow Jesus.
I think it was probably not that long afterwards, actually, that I first bumped into Ravi as a student myself at Oxford University. I believe he came to the to be the speaker at the mission in 2000 for OIQ.
Yeah, that's right.
And I suspect you have memories, of course, of that time as well. I just remember myself just being blown away, sitting in St. Ebbs, listening to one of his lectures and thinking, gosh, it sort of ignited something in me, I have to say, of what the Christian intellectual tradition can be and do. So that's our experiences perhaps overlap a little bit in those Oxford years.
That was an amazing week. I don't know if you remember students, hundreds of students queuing up down Pembroke Street to get into St. Ebbs to hear Ravi speak every day for a week. So many people became Christians that week. It was an extraordinary season in Oxford's life as a city, and real privilege to be there. I remember very aggressive questions being asked and Ravi handling them with his usual sort of grace and ability, but getting to lead students to Christ in tears as they were receiving him after those talks. So wonderful memories of that week. Yeah.
I've just shifted my camera slightly towards the bookcase because somewhere in there is the book I actually received on that mission, Can Man Live Without God, which was being given out to the students in that week. But let's meet Abdu and Vince as well. Abdu, tell us about your sort of first memories of meeting or hearing at least about Ravi and his ministry.
Well, my first encounter with Ravi wasn't so glorious. It was actually just sort of mundane, it seemed, at least at the time. And thanks for doing this, Justin. It's just such an amazing opportunity to talk about the man who's influenced all three of us so much. I was driving through mid-Michigan, which is a very rural area of the state I'm from, and on a Sunday morning, and I wasn't a Christian. I wasn't even close to becoming a Christian yet. And this is back before iPods and iPhones and digital media that could pipe in music to your car at your whim and at your fingertips. You were beholden to the scan button to cycle through the radio stations to give you some form of entertainment once my tapes all ran out. And this is in fact back when tapes were still a thing. I heard an Indian accented voice over the radio, because I was skipping through the stations, because back then all there was on a Sunday morning in the middle of Michigan was Christian music or country music, and I had no taste for either, back then at least. But then I hear this Indian accented voice talking about Jesus, and I'm thinking to myself, first of all, I've never heard an Indian talk about Jesus. Second of all, I've never heard someone talk this intelligently about Jesus. And back when I was a Muslim, I thought Christianity was just this sort of wishful thinking, well-meaning but wrong-headed kind of view. And I was annoyed because I thought, well, I don't like that he's talking this intelligently about this. But then I became enthralled because he was quoting poetry. And I'm an Arab, and that is our language in so many ways. The poetry and communicating beauty and truth through poetry is such a big part of our heritage. In fact, even in pre-Islamic days, sometimes tribal disputes were decided by poetry contests. We were the first rap battlers, as it were. And I was just enthralled by how can he weave poetry into philosophy? This is fascinating to me. Well, that began a search online for, not online, I'm sorry, this is well before online was even remotely close to being powerful. On the airwaves, I had to like actually call people and say, hey, have you heard of this guy? And where is his radio station at? Started listening to Ravi's stuff. I got tapes of the Harvard Veritas Forum eventually, listened to those. Again, not a Christian. It would be years before I became a Christian, a couple of years before I became a Christian. Well, couple is kind of a wrong way to put it. It would be quite a few years before I became a Christian, but he was part of that. He really introduced me to this world of apologetics, and from there, other names came on. But Ravi's style was so important to me in the way he communicated the gospel. And then once I became a Christian, this is a bit of the poetry. You know, Ravi speaks about the Grand Weaver, and he writes about it in his book, The Grand Weaver. And I remember I was a Christian for 3 years. It was 2003. I became a believer in the year 2000. And Ravi was coming to the University of Michigan, which is my alma mater, both law school and undergraduate. And he was coming to do an open forum. And I knew about this. A friend called me and said, do you know Ravi Zacharias is coming to town? Which amazed me that it just escaped my attention. I don't know how this escaped my attention, but he was coming to town. So I called my wife, I called my best friend, and I said, we're going to Ann Arbor. It's about an hour away. Get your stuff. We're going. I'm leaving work early. We got there, and he was answering questions. He was doing his thing. Well, the Q&A time came up, and I have a question. I still had a burning question, despite having been a believer now for 3 years. I still had a couple pretty important questions that were unresolved in my mind. And I got in line, and they said, we want to give priority to the skeptic, because ever the evangelist, you know. While I had a question a skeptic would have, I wasn't a skeptic. So I was asking people in the line, I'm like, hey, are you a Christian? No. Well, go ahead of me. Are you a Christian? No. Go ahead of me. So the line's getting longer and longer and longer. And I'm thinking, I'm not going to get to ask a question. And sure enough, right before I got to the microphone, they said, no more questions. I'm like, oh, come on. So he's standing by the dais, and I went over, this shall not stand. I have to go ask him a question. So I asked him a question. And he says, well, what's your name? And I said, Abdu. And he says, that's a Muslim name. I'm like, yeah, I used to be a Muslim. And I went into the story a little bit, told him how he was influential in my journey. And he said, well, do you know this person and this person? He starts doing that. And as if I know all the Lebanese in the world. There's 8 million of us. I only know about 4 million of us. Anyway, he began to answer my question in the way a Middle Easterner would be answered. It's just very much just soaked, sort of olive oil soaked, his answer. And I left the venue with my wife and my best friend, and just amazed by what I had heard. He really settled the question in my mind quite well. We sat down at a coffee shop to get caffeinated for the drive home. And I said, I don't know if I'm ever going to do ministry, but I was looking to be a partner at a major law firm. And I said, but if I ever do answer a question of somebody's, whether it's in public or in private, I want to answer a question the way that man answered it. Mm-hmm. Fast forward 14 years later, in 2017, I'm standing next to him on a stage at the University of Michigan, answering questions with him. And I looked at, because of the tapestry of the moment, I couldn't get over it. And I'm normally very nervous before I speak, no matter how big or how small the audience. But when they introduce me, they say, Abdu Murray, it goes away. It never went away that night. I think because of the gravity and the tapestry of the moment. And that is the Grand Weaver.
Yeah, brilliant. And what about you, Vince? Tell us about your first memories of meeting Ravi.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. It's a real privilege to be here with all of you. And Abdu, I appreciate that you're one of the only people ever to voluntarily move back in the line when waiting to ask Ravi Zacharias a question. So I appreciate that about you.
Do that again.
My first memories of Ravi were from afar while journeying towards faith at Princeton as a skeptic and engaging with his writings. It was then later, after I was brought onto the team in Oxford by Amy and Michael Ramsden, that I really had my first meeting with him. And one of the first memories I have is our speaking team meeting where we all gathered that year. We do this annually. And it was in Chennai, India. And I remember Ravi walking up to me and a couple of others at a buffet table and asking if I would be involved in putting together an online curriculum. That was a big new initiative that we'd be launching as a ministry. And I remember thinking at the time, like, why would he ask me? I had just joined the team. He barely knew me. He was clearly extending an invitation to me, which was beyond what I deserved. And that's probably one of the key narratives in terms of my experience of Ravi throughout my life. The same thing happened when he approached me after a publisher had approached him about writing a book together. And again, I thought, are you serious? You know, you're going to allow someone else's name to be on a book with you who's a graduate student at a secular university that you don't know that well, and who knows what ultimately I'm going to wind up believing. And then later, a similar story to you, Abdu, to being invited to speak with Ravi at Princeton was a really significant experience, actually in a classroom that I took a class in as an undergraduate. And that was amazing to be there with Ravi alongside, and almost to be able to see myself as a skeptical undergraduate in the audience. So I think that's probably something of the narrative of my experience of Ravi, just always extending to me and to everyone else around him more than was deserved, extending grace. And I think he really felt like that was the case in his life, and that's where that came from. In fact, one of the last conversations that I had with Ravi and Margie and my wife Jo was on the phone as well, and he said, I gave myself 17 years and then I tried to take my life. God gave me 57 more, and on into eternity. I have nothing but gratitude. And I think that was something of Ravi's experience of life and understanding of his Savior, that he had just been given so much more than he deserved, that his natural inclination with other people was to extend to them much more than they deserved.
Mm. I want to talk about Ravi's life, his upbringing, his journey to faith, and obviously the years when he was establishing the ministry. I thought one way we could get into that is to cast our minds back all the way to 1983. And this was quite an important moment, I think, when Ravi was invited to speak for Billy Graham, for preach really, to an evangelist conference in Amsterdam. I've got a little clip of something he said, and I just think this clip is so great because it could have been preached yesterday, quite frankly, what he says in this clip. So let's listen to it, and then I'd just love to get you guys' reactions to this clip.
The loneliest moment in life is when you have just experienced that which you thought would deliver the ultimate, and it has let you down. The loneliest moment in life is when you have just experienced that which you thought would deliver the ultimate, and it has let you down. And in this push-button crazy advanced societies in which some people live, sit down at home and watch the video, get into a machine and break all kinds of barriers and move to this dimension in all kinds of experiences just by the pushing of the button. The European scene, the North American scene has demonstrated at least one thing, that man's loneliness and hopelessness is only being heightened as his advances continue to impede upon him.
Well, if you just swapped out push a button for tap a screen, very little has changed in many ways. Amy, just tell us about this particular conference and why it was significant, and what Ravi shared there, and why it sort of really propelled him, I think, in many ways into the consciousness of a lot more people.
So Billy Graham approached Ravi to speak in 1983 at this gathering of evangelists, and the message is called The Lostness of Man. And it's absolutely vintage Ravi. It's quite moving to hear it again, actually. I mean, the message kind of, I guess, paints a picture of how our technological advances, our pursuit of materialism, our embracing of a godless ideology, the promise of kind of economic fulfillment, all of these things that Western culture in particular have idealized as that which can fill our hearts with meaning, but all of it has left us utterly bankrupt and lost. And he describes the human condition in 1983, but actually it's very, very resonant today. And that desperate emptiness and hunger for those who are pleasure seeking, and then lands the message in Christ crucified and resurrected. It was an extraordinary message, I think, because at the time, a lot of evangelism was focused either on a sort of simple gospel proclamation from maybe a New Testament passage, or an appeal to people who may be socially disadvantaged through the gospel as good news and salvation. But what Ravi was doing was describing the human condition as people experienced it, and locating that as an experience of lostness, really, I guess, grounding the concept of sin and what it means to be dead in our sins, and then showing how humanity's questions and our search for meaning can be a pathway to the cross and the resurrection. And as a result of that message, he began to be invited all over the world actually to preach. And the messages that Abdu mentioned at Harvard in 1992, which launched the Veritas Forum and I think really modelled a new era of university evangelism. Those messages are actually rooted in the concepts that are there in that 1983 talk. It's an extraordinary listen. Yeah.
And I think it was shortly after really that RZIM itself was founded as a
it was the following year that
yeah.
RZIM was founded as a ministry, and God's timing was amazing with that, because that was all through another individual coming alongside Ravi and enabling him to plant the ministry. Yeah.
I should say, guys, feel free to, if you want to put something in, just raise your finger and we'll make sure to hear from you. But Abdu, I mean, this was mentioned briefly already, I think, but hearing him talk about the emptiness, obviously that was an experience he'd had as that 17-year-old. Do you want to just take us through what brought him to that point, as far as you're aware, his experiences up to that point, perhaps some of his background, in India, in Kerala, where he was raised, and so on, and what shifted, what happened when he went through this period of a very bleak sort of nihilism, really, as a teenager?
Yeah, and nihilism is a good way to put it, that he eventually came to. He was raised in a nominally Anglican family with some Hindu roots. Didn't really have much in the way of an affinity towards anything really spiritual. He had plenty of Muslim, plenty of Hindu, plenty of Christian friends, whether nominal or otherwise. But Ravi's heart was on the cricket field. It was not in the classroom. And if anybody knows anything about the Eastern and Indian culture, obviously education and success are very, very, at a very high premium. And in fact, because he comes from an honor and shame culture, performance is everything, because not only reflects on you, but it reflects on the family, it reflects on the community and all these things. And his father was sort of working his way up in the ranks of Indian government and was a very, very successful man in those senses. While they didn't have, palaces or anything, these kind of things, they had humble surroundings. His father was actually quite successful, and his siblings were showing promise academically, but Ravi was not, for various reasons. He just couldn't get his mind into it, as it were. So what he started to see was that he was going to be, and he puts this in his book, Walking from East to West, and in various talks he's given, he shared the story, and even with us privately as well, where, so I'm not betraying any trust when I say that his father had looked at him and said, essentially, you're going to be an embarrassment, which is the equivalent, the Indian equivalent, and it's the Middle Eastern, and it's the Far Asian equivalent of saying, you are going to be nothing at some point. You are going to be the worst thing you could possibly be to a family. In an honor-shame culture, you're going to be the source of our shame. Now, that's one way to incentivize behavior, but it's also a way to incentivize meaninglessness and hopelessness. And so in a particular setting, when he had basically come to the end of himself and said, all of this has no meaning anyway. Success would have no meaning even if I could achieve it. There's no way to get this sort of meaning in the world around me. He decided that at 17, since it was all in fact meaningless, he would be better off, and everyone else would be better off, if he just didn't exist at all. And so went into a classroom, I believe it was a chemistry classroom, where you'd find the chemicals needed. He didn't even look at what he was putting into the vial, as it were, just put them all there together, ran over to his home, went into the bathroom, locked the door, and swallowed it down as fast as he could. So it was that sense of meaninglessness, and that achievement couldn't get you there, even if you did get it, that drove him to that point of attempting suicide. And I think I remember him saying that the saltiness of the solution he had drank was so bad that he suddenly clamoring for water and all these things, and realizing in that moment that this was probably not the way to go. And he was found clinging on to life by a thread, brought to the hospital. And then as he was laying there in bed recovering, someone had brought his mother a Bible, and his mother was reading it in her cracked English, and read the words, "Because I live, you also shall live." And Ravi, sort of opening his eyes barely, asked her to read it again. And then he realized that this is where meaning actually could be. This might be where it is. And to put it his way, he says, "If you get me out of this, Lord, I will leave no stone unturned in my pursuit of the truth." But by the way, just as a fascinating thing, oftentimes you see people who are, engaged, who are in the middle of some kind of trouble, whether it's an addiction they're facing, or it's that sense of meaningless, or their marriage is failing, or they're physically in peril. When they bargain with God, it's more like, "God, if you get me out of this, I'll give to charity. If you get me out of this, I'll be a better husband. If you get me out of this." He didn't do that. He did almost a Solomonic way of saying it, is that God would give Solomon anything, and Solomon asked for wisdom. Ravi asked for truth. What an amazing thing to ask for at the moment of your despair. He didn't ask for health. He didn't ask for any of those things. He said, "If you get me out of this, I will leave no stone unturned in my pursuit of truth." And that is amazing, because he saw the truth in those words, "Because I live, you also shall live." Just utterly amazing.
It's an amazing story. One that I'm sure you've heard a few times yourself, Vince, but in a way, his search for meaning at that point obviously became a theme in so much of his speaking, and obviously his writing as well over the years. And just as relevant, if not more today, we see a rise in the number of young men committing suicide today. We see all kinds of issues around meaning and purpose and identity being expressed as people are kind of losing themselves to some extent in social media and in all of the issues that often raises as well among young people, especially. So in a way, it feels like that message has never been more relevant, and I guess has been continued to be spread, not just by Ravi, but all the rest of you guys who are working, now obviously continuing to spread that legacy.
Yeah, I think you're right, Justin. And you can hear it even in that clip that you showed as Ravi is preaching. You can tell that he's preaching as someone who experienced brokenness himself, and then who met God in a very personal way. And if you think of Ravi's life and his ministry, you think about that pursuit of truth, and you also think about the pursuit of people. Those are sort of two hallmarks of Ravi's ministry. And the thing is that they're deeply, deeply connected, because he came to understand that truth is a person. When he moved away from that nihilism and understood that truth could be pursued, he found that in the person of Jesus. And so these are not just two independent elements of Ravi's ministry. He pursues truth and he pursues people. It's rather that he came to find truth and understand truth in the context of truth being a person, in the person of Jesus Christ. And so these two things are always fully integrated with Ravi. He's pursuing truth, he's pursuing the person, and people can feel that. They can feel that their question is not seen by Ravi as a weapon. He's not defensive when they put a question to him. He sees a question as a window to their soul, because yes, he's pursuing truth, but one and the same for him was always pursuing the person. And I think that's why he spoke to so many people and will continue to speak to so many people, because people could tell on that intuitive level, even as we hear him preach, that he was never dealing with truth to the exclusion of the person. He was always inviting a person on a pursuit of truth that ultimately would end in a person and a relationship as well.
I was just reading some biography of him just in the last day or two, and there was this extraordinary story that this was before the 1983 conference, that he was invited, having sort of been recognized for his preaching, to go to Vietnam and preach to some of the people serving there and so on. This was obviously in the 60s, and obviously some extraordinary stories about I don't know if you can tell this better than me, Amy, but once when he was sort of on some kind of track and their Jeep broke down, and they were overtaken by someone else who didn't stop to help them, and just moments, when they did get going, moments later, they discovered this Jeep overturned, shot up with bullets, and that could have been them. But I don't know how formative those sorts of experiences were. What was sort of going on in Ravi's life, having made this commitment to Christ? What was shaping his ministry and the way he was starting to reach people during that time? And obviously turning from this, not particularly, people didn't think much of him in terms of his academic abilities, to suddenly being very engaged apparently with the philosophy and the culture and all of those things that he became known for in his speaking, Amy.
Yeah, so the trip to Vietnam, and then he went back a second time to Southeast Asia 4 years later in his 20s, both of those were extremely formative experiences for Ravi. He escaped with his life on a couple of occasions and had one or two sleepless nights hearing sort of bullets fired, and had the joy of leading captured Viet Cong to Christ. I mean, really, really amazing numbers of American servicemen became Christians through that preaching tour. He was sent by his denomination, CMA. Funnily enough, that's one of the things he and I initially really connected over, because Michael Ramsden, who'd introduced us, was trying to get Frog and I to share the story of how we had met the Taliban and taken Bibles to them. And I remember Ravi's reaction to that, thinking back to those Vietnam days, and that sense that when you see God at work in that kind of context where it really is life and death, and where the struggle against God is just so incredibly evil, and yet God is at work in that sort of situation, it grounded him with a confidence that evangelism is God's work, that salvation is something he does, and we're a tool in that. We're a conduit of the Holy Spirit. It's his work, not ours. So I don't really see a contradiction between that kind of passionate preaching in Southeast Asia and a mini revival. It's documented in a book called Ambassadors for Christ, that because so many people became Christians over that time. There's not a contradiction between that and the more I guess cerebral intellectual presentation of the Christian faith. The heart of the evangelist sort of was beating through both of those things. And I think for Ravi it was a strength that he was so reliant on God. I mean, he addressed our OCA students every year, and they always asked him questions. And just this year, one of the students asked him, what would you do differently, or what's one of your regrets? And he shared that, he hadn't had the opportunity to do a PhD, that sort of level of postgraduate study, and that he would have loved to, but God just didn't open that door for him. He was supporting a family and at a different stage in life didn't have the means, but yet God used him to speak in Oxford and Harvard and Princeton and the greatest centres of learning. And it was really was God at work through him in those places so clearly. So yeah, I think those early experiences of sort of pioneering very dangerous mission work where he escaped with his life kind of formed the muscles of the courage it took to stand on Princeton stage or speak at Cambridge. Yeah,
I'd love to, in the next section of the programme, explore a bit more, in a sense, the way that his own cultural background helped him to speak, obviously, into many other cultures, and also just his ability as well, even, as he got into more advanced years, to still connect with young people, which I think was one of the things where we hear. So I've heard so many stories on my social media, people saying they remember when, they were able to spend some time with him, and most of them, younger than me, and I like to think of myself as young, but maybe not as
we
young.
all.
We're with you now, Justin.
And Justin, I was just thinking on that point, just briefly, that when Ravi was being commissioned, as Amy was saying, to go over to Vietnam, he was commissioned by his church, and a group of the elders gathered around him and prayed for him. He knelt over a chair as he prayed, and when they all got up after the prayer, one of the elders came up and said, God is going to bless that young man. When we got up for praying, there was a pool of tears on the chair. And so I'm just thinking of that courage, Amy, that you're talking about, and then that tenderheartedness of the tears on the chair on his way there, and then the courage that was forged in Vietnam. And I think in some ways those two things together, that tenderheartedness and then that uncompromising courage for the gospel, that really encapsulate who Ravi is.
Brilliant. We're going to go to a quick break and we'll be back very shortly. We're talking about the life and legacy of Ravi Zacharias today on Unbelievable.
What I want to invite Roger to comment on is, why couldn't the mental realm include an infinite consciousness?
It's too much like us. It's too much
we're like
putting it like, yes, like the Greek views of the gods in some sense. They were like too much like us.
They were finite and contingent. Here we're talking about a metaphysically necessary source.
I admire this noble aspiration to find the highest possible ideal. It's almost as if you're proposing a new religion to meet this new challenge.
It's not a new religion.
Yes.
What it is something that sits in the same place. It addresses some of the same needs, but it is not founded on the same principle.
If the New Testament says that Jesus did X, Y, and Z, did he do it or not?
I don't think it's a story that's made by committee. Am I going to have a later literary genius who comes up with a great story like this? Or am I going to say, no, Jesus is the genius, and somehow that story has basically been preserved?
He conquered not in spite of the dark mystery of evil, he conquered through it. He conquered not in spite of the dark mystery of evil, he conquered through it. Through the process of suffering, you realize how finite you are and how desperately you need the very presence of God to carry you through. The hymn writer Annie Johnston Flint, who was orphaned early in life and then later on had rheumatoid arthritis, lost control over internal organs, became incontinent, blind, and cancer invaded her body. Her biography is called The Making of the Beautiful. Orphaned, incontinent, arthritic, cancerous, blind. She wrote many hymns. One of them was this: He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To added affliction he addeth his mercy. To multiplied trials his multiplied peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. His love has no limit, his grace has no measure, his power has no boundaries known unto men, for out of his infinite riches in Jesus he giveth and giveth and giveth again.
Again, taken from a talk given by Ravi, and in a way he was used to, as many of you guys have as well, speaking on the issue of suffering. But of course it was something he had to face himself at various points in his life, but particularly obviously in the last few months. This really came quickly, I think. I think you were with him in January, Amy. I think, Abdu, you were in Sri Lanka with Ravi in February. So what were those months like? And can you just describe, maybe, Abdu, what happened sort of in fairly short order thereafter?
Well, actually, all of us were with Ravi at a meeting we had with him in the Philippines, and he was complaining about, and he complained so infrequently, which alarmed us because he was complaining at all. Here's a man who's lived a lot of pain for a lot of years, and he was talking about the intensity of the pain in his back. He sought various treatments for it, and usually he thought it was just because of the fusion he has in his back. Some of his vertebrae are fused together. Pardon me. Turns out that was partly what it was. Well, we went from the Philippines, he and I, to Sri Lanka we were filming some things. There was a pastor's conference. Louis Giglio joined him. I joined him. Jeff Vines, Edmund Chan, and a few others had joined him on our team. Max Jagannathan and others had joined him for this pastor's conference in Sri Lanka for Indian pastors and Sri Lankan pastors. And the pain persisted. In fact, it got worse. I remember walking into the lounge area, and he walked in very gingerly every morning and would ask, "Are you preparing? Are you studying for your talks?" And I said, "No, Ravi, please sit down." And he'd sat down, and I asked him, "How much sleep did you get?" And he'd say, "About 45 minutes a night, every night, the whole time we were there." And we were there for a week. Gosh. And he preached up a storm. I just don't know how he did it. And he was meeting with people pretty much every day. And he had just come off of a very significant event in the Philippines as well. We just didn't know what was going on with him, and he had consulted various doctors, and really he didn't have the time to go get a scan done. We were filming various pieces to a video curriculum for the book we had coming out. It's out now, but then it wasn't published yet, called Seeing Jesus from the East. And I was with him to film the whole thing about what it means to be a Christian and be Eastern or Middle Eastern. And if I can digress for a moment, there was this period, and I got some funny stories from the whole thing too, but there was this period where we walked into a very large bazaar, a very large market, where the sights and the smells and the sounds and all of it were just abuzz. And Ravi loves those settings. And we got out of the bus, and he's got that bald spot on the back of his head. I'm trying to catch up apparently, but not quite there yet. And he was looking for a baseball cap that could cover his head. And he was dodging and weaving in and out of all the various people who were there. It was very crowded, to find the right shop with the right baseball cap that he could have to cover. And I remember thinking, he is in his element right now. It's the Eastern smells and the sights and the sounds. I've longed to see this in him. And he was like practically, I mean, he wasn't running, but it was very fast paced. Mm-hmm. I was like Olympic power walking to stay up with him. And I remember thinking, your back was just a mess, this morning. But something just woke up in him. And my funny part of the story is that he found a baseball cap that he liked. And it was black, and it had silver stitching on the front of it, and it said, "Think it over." Now, the reason why that's funny is, one, because of the whole idea of just let my people think, and just thinking in the radio programs and the podcasts. And he says, this is appropriate, right? This is appropriate for me. Is this okay for me? And I remember thinking, kind of, because that phrase, "think it over," when you put it on a shirt or a cap, is kind of a threat. When young boys get upset with each other and they start to get to puff their chests out, another guy will say, "Think it over," that kind of thing, which is so not Ravi. That's not him. Yeah. But it was just the best there. And but we left Sri Lanka to go to a university open forum at the University of Miami, which ended up being his last one.
Nice.
And the pain was so bad that you could tell from the stage. You could actually tell, which is unusual again, because that's not how Ravi lets on. Mm-hmm. And his colleague Sanj Kalra looked at me from the audience, and I could see he said, "This is the last question." And Ravi left abruptly, had to leave because of the pain, and came home. And during the surgery, this is the interesting thing, he had a surgery on his back because the screws had in fact become loose, the ones that were bolting him down, and the surgeon found out. What actually didn't even find out, just saw a funny spot. And the surgeons typically, they stay laser focused on their task. Mm-hmm. They don't go and venture in other parts where they're not specialists. But he saw something that didn't look right to him. He had a biopsy done of that part that didn't look right to him, and it turns out it was a sarcoma. And then from there, Ravi was sent to various places to get opinions on how to treat it. Went to MD Anderson, and we had found out that the sarcoma was responding to the treatment, but it metastasized to the point where it couldn't be controlled anymore, and he was able to come home and rest comfortably until he passed.
As I say, Vince, I think everyone was sort of shocked at how quickly things did escalate in that way. And obviously you guys are still coming to terms with this. We're recording this, less than 48 hours from his death being announced. But how are you and the team, and what's the general feeling right now? Obviously a lot of shock, inevitably, and still probably not yet processed everything that this means for you guys.
Yeah, there's certainly heavy hearts for all of us. some sense of emptiness, just not to have our friends around and not be able to laugh with him as we always would. But I think there's a real sense of privilege as well to have seen the way that Ravi and his family journeyed through this. I think when you get to a point where you're so weak that you couldn't put a mask on, metaphorically, even if you wanted to, what shines through has to be the reality of who the person is. And we saw Ravi go through this in a really beautiful way. Actually, when he had the back surgery in the first place, afterwards we had a meal train set up so that various members of the team could bring a meal for the family. And after my wife and I had brought a meal, Ravi sent an email to Joe with me copied in, thanking Joe for the meal. I'm not sure why he assumed it was Joe, but yes, it was primarily Joe. I was the sous chef, and he thanked her like with such encouragement. It was just one of these emails you just thought, wow, he took the time to. And then at 9 p.m., that was at 6 p.m. Then at 9 p.m., he wrote again after they had eaten the dessert to again encourage Joe and bless her and say this was Michelin standard. And it was just, so wonderful. We found out later, and then I went back and looked at the date of those emails. That was the day after he had received his cancer diagnosis. And that just really convicted me, to ask the question, what would be on my mind? What would be on my heart? What would be the emails that I would be writing the day after I received a severe cancer diagnosis? And so just seeing the way that Ravi went through this, seeing the way that his faith only increased, even in his last days and week, the things that would come out of his mouth would be scripture and hymns and telling his family that he loved them and honoring Margie. Exactly the things that you would hope would come out of someone's mouth. Margie wrote to the team, "This is the man I married." The same passion for the gospel was there right to the very end, and it was beautiful to see. I've been thinking a lot this week about in Romans 5, it just says suffering produces endurance, endurance character, and character hope. And actually, apologetics is all about passing on hope, that famous verse we often go to in 1 Peter 3:15, give the reason for the hope that you have. And the Bible tells us where hope comes from. It comes from character. It's produced by character. And I think that's one of the reasons why Ravi was so effective at sharing the faith, because that's about sharing hope. And hope comes from character. And that character came through the endurance that he knew because he had suffered, but he suffered with Christ alongside in a beautiful way.
Were you able to be in touch with him in the last few weeks much, Amy? I know that you wrote a letter actually as well.
Yeah, I was able to be in touch towards the end. And I was just really struck by his care for me. I mean, I was trying to be in touch with him and share love and thanks. And there was just such love for the other always for him. And I think for me, that's one of the hallmarks of Ravi, that he was very unselfish, very uncompetitive. He loved creating platform and opportunity for other people. He wanted the gospel to go out and Jesus to be known. He was an extraordinary person, and he faced death as he'd lived, with faith and with courage, with kindness. There wasn't, complaining or even asking for prayer for himself. He wouldn't have dreamt of asking for that, asking for the family. But it was,
Yeah,
it's quite hard to talk
I
about.
I get that. No. Look, let me read some of the things that came in when I asked people to just comment on my Facebook and Twitter. So many, and this is just a tiny selection really of some of the comments that came in. Michael said, "No one in my lifetime has had a greater impact upon my understanding and application of the gospel of Jesus Christ. God used him to help me think, stretch my faith in ways that would not have otherwise happened. Heaven's gain is our loss." Ollie said, "Fantastic man, articulated the Christian worldview at the highest level of intellect, philosophically brilliant, truly humble. He will be missed." Roger, this is painful news. I think this is the first Roger was hearing of it. "I love this man and I never met him. May you always be in God's light eternal, Mr. Zacharias." And even from skeptics who've been commenting actually on the page, Jim said, while I've never been convinced of anything he's ever said, I do have respect for him as a thinker. Condolences to his family. And others. I thought this was a great one from Dana, who got in touch on the Facebook and said, this is a bit longer, but bear with me. It amazes me how much he traveled the globe over the years, how diverse his audiences were, and how clearly and graciously he was able to communicate across cultural, religious, and generational divides. He addressed world leaders from east to west and came away with unlikely friendships and stories of changed hearts. I always loved those stories. I also watched him engage with young college students, one-on-one, with respect and care, as though they were the only one in the room. His priority was always the questioner. In other words, the question mattered, but the person asking it mattered more. No difference of opinion or challenging topic prevented him from showing God's love. And Dana goes on to say, I'm sure many of us will continue our learning, revisit his books, pore over his audio and video sermons, and share his work. But how can we, the benefactors of his life's work, be fruitful with all this learning? I'm reminded of a question he was once asked by a Hindu friend, which I've heard was the question that bothered him most. If this conversion you speak about is truly supernatural, then why is it not more evident in the lives of so many Christians that I know? Perhaps one of the most important and most urgent ways we can honor Ravi's legacy is to answer this question with our lives, writes Dana, which I thought was just, a really helpful and a great sentiment. I mean, let's talk about that ability of his to connect with people. I mean, firstly, for me, one of the joys of listening to Ravi is it's just a joy to listen to Ravi. And he was such a good communicator. He had almost a poetic way with words. I'd say he was an orator in that sense. I love some of his illustrations and his anecdotes. I mean, what do you think it was about him that connected so strongly with so many audiences? Because that isn't a gift everyone has, but for him, he evidently did have it in an extraordinary way. I don't know, Vince, if you want to talk about the way he connected with people in that way.
Yeah, well, the progression of that is really, interesting in his life, because he was developing in his faith and in his ministry at a time where there was something of an anti-intellectualism among evangelical Christians. And even when Ravi was going to go to graduate studies, a mentor of his said, I caution against it. He said, you will lose your keen edge. And those words, keen edge, were always imprinted in Ravi's mind. He never wanted to lose his keen edge. But he did go. He was then teaching at seminary, and there was a pivotal point where he was speaking in Toronto, and he had used a bit of Aquinas and a bit of Augustine in a point that he was making. And someone walked up to him afterwards and said, you're speaking to an audience that's not there. This is totally irrelevant to the average person here. And when Ravi told me that story, he followed up by saying he was correct, that actually he wasn't connecting what he was saying with the average person. And so Ravi had this real challenge, because he always felt that we needed to put the faith on a high shelf, so that we need to get on our toes in order to reach it, and we would be growing in our faith in the process. So that was very important to him. And yet he felt called to everyone, to all people. He felt called to bring the knowledge of the faith to the kitchen table, as he would put it. And so how do you encourage people to reach higher than they think they can reach, and yet bring that faith down to the kitchen table? And this is where I think, Ravi, as an Easterner who was so fluent in the West, is so significant in terms of the way God wove his story together, because Ravi had this appreciation of story, even from the religions of his birthplace. And he was brilliant with story. And so he was able to connect argument and story, the story of the East, the analytical reasoning of the West, in a really significant way. And actually, even the first time that Ravi used a movie illustration, it was Chariots of Fire. And you can't imagine a safer film to use now as a Christian preacher in a sermon than Chariots of Fire. And when Ravi did it, though, it was radical. And Ravi then would go from country to country. In various countries, people were saying to him, we heard you used a movie illustration in a sermon. That's unheard of. But Ravi was finding that if he took the knowledge of the empirical sciences, of philosophy, of sociology, but he then connected it with a current illustration, then he could speak to the current generation. And that's why I think he was so transcultural, but also why he was so transgenerational as well. He was able to speak to different generations, and why he was so passionate about handing the faith down to different generations, because he was able to connect the knowledge and the arguments with the illustrations of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple here actually. One of the ones I love, it's got like millions of views on YouTube, I think, but there's this great clip you can find on YouTube of in some sort of Q&A session. One of you guys might even have been on the stage with him. There's a young skeptic who's saying, don't you realize that all morality is relative, and you know, we've just got to get used to that, and blah blah blah. And he just comes back with this one line. He says, do you lock your doors at night? And it's just like, he nails it. It was such a good response, and obviously then elaborates on it. But I mean, Abdu, what about for you? You've already said that one of the reasons you sort of lit up when you started hearing Ravi on the radio all those years ago was because it felt like he was connecting, and there was something about, obviously, that he comes from the East, and you hadn't heard that. And I think a lot of people, you know, it's almost it's interesting, isn't it, that one of the most influential thinkers and evangelists of our generation is not white. And in that sense, what was it about Ravi that obviously crossed these cultural boundaries, but was able to speak to both East and West so in such, you know, in such a specific way?
Well, I think it was so interesting because I think it was not only the accent with which he spoke, the quality of the oratory, which was so eloquent and beautiful and poetic, as you pointed out, but also the content was so steeped in illustration, which is very, very Eastern, but also in philosophy. And he would go for the argument as well. His model was argue, illustrate, and apply. You know, you argue theory, which he called level 1, and you illustrate at level 2, then you apply personally at level 3. So he always wanted to make, no matter how academic the content was, he always wanted to make it very personal at the end, because he was ever the evangelist. You know, it's interesting, you look at the tagline for our ministry, what is helping the thinker to believe and the believer to think. And that order is not a mistake. He wanted the thinker to believe. He was an evangelist, but he wanted to evangelize the thinker and helping the believer think. The thing that I thought was so beautiful about the way Ravi communicated and used his oratory gifts was that he didn't lord it over anybody. You didn't expect to feel like, well, that was either he was raising it up to a level to show off. And I've been around, and all of us have heard plenty of people who are obviously intellectually gifted, and they don't mind telling you that they are either. But he was obviously intellectually and rhetorically gifted, but minded telling you. He didn't want you to come off thinking, to him, I think that one of the worst things you could say to him was, wow, that was amazing. Way over my head, but it was amazing. He would have not liked that. And none of us do, really, do we? But he had the ability to say, I'm not going to condescend to you because I don't believe you're below me. I'm going to give it as not water it down, make it as robust as it needs to be, because I think he did believe that not only the common person, in terms of rank and file person outside the church, but the church itself could rise to the level of the expectation that the speaker set. And he had high expectations for both the secular person and the church as well, and raised them. I remember sitting at a barbecue joint with him in Texas. And we were sitting there with a fellow, one of our fellows, who is one of our younger speakers. And as we sit there, a guy who is rounder than he is tall waddles over to the table. And he's got the mesh back hat, and he's got the big thick beard, and in a very thick Southern accent said, "Excuse me, sir, you Ravi?" And Ravi, of course, you know, says to him, "It depends who's asking. Why don't you answer the question?" Because I'm the biggest guy in the room. I'm 6'8", 280 pounds. And this guy is not a small man. And he said, "I want you to know, I listen to you every day. And you answered so many of my questions." And he went on and on about the doubts he had. We were walking out of the parking lot, and he stopped me and Daniel Rangel, who was the fellow who's there. And he stopped and he says, "Isn't it amazing who listens to the program?" And he looked at Daniel and looked at me and he said, "Everyone's a thinker." And that's why I think he connected.
Just before we go to our final break, Amy, I wonder, off stage. Was Ravi the same? What was it like being around him, and what sort of conversations happened kind of once the talk was over and he was down with the students or whoever was at the talk? You know, what would you typically see Ravi doing and saying and interacting?
It's been really lovely to see the tributes online and so many people expressing that experience of Ravi, that the man behind the sort of stage persona was the same person, humble, brilliant, actually incredibly witty. He was the king of the one-liner. You know, you knew you were going to be in stitches at some point in any conversation with him. That same passion, so for me, what really marks Ravi's preaching out was the passion sort of coursing through him, the power of God, calling people home to Christ, the power of the cross, and the incredible emotional empathy as well. You just knew that he loved you as the listener, and God's love actually flowed through him, I think. And I feel like those same characteristics, that passion for truth, the humour and the wit, and that care and love for the person were very much evident off stage. You know, I've been there in conversation with him as he sort of gently listened to all kinds of questions, even quite aggressive articulations of disagreement, and lovingly stood with the person and processed with them and led them to Christ. So a personal evangelist as well as an evangelist on the stage, willing to take time with people as well. And I think not to rush through the seriousness of the question, willing to actually work through with a person their doubts and issues. I think we've all learned from that. So very much the real deal, but the man behind the kind of the big stage persona. He was a person who loved people, loved his family, loved God.
We're going to go to a final break, and we'll have another 10 or 15 minutes to continue to talk about Ravi. Special edition of Unbelievable today, where I'm joined by Amy Orr-Ewing, Vince Vitale and Abdu Murray, all, of course, speakers and have various roles with RZIM. And we'll obviously want to talk about what the future looks like for RZIM and for Christian thinkers, apologetics in general, as we lose one of its great champions at this point. But we're going to continue the conversation very shortly here on Unbelievable.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Briley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
May I please close in prayer. One day we will stand before you, and Lord, I have absolutely no doubt we'll be silent, because everything about you will transcend anything we could say.
Something Ravi is experiencing now himself. We're remembering his life, his legacy on Unbelievable today. I'm really pleased to be joined for this special edition of the show by Amy Orr-Ewing, Vince Vitale and Abdu Murray. Just in that last section, Amy was mentioning just what Ravi was like off stage. So many know him for his on-stage appearance. That's what most of the YouTube videos you'll see are like. But of course, you guys knew him very well, just as Ravi off stage. Just any thoughts and memories really of what that was like, the way he interacted with people, his personality. Maybe Vince, you'd like to kick us off with that.
Sure. This we could talk about for a long time, but I won't. We will really miss laughing with Ravi. I remember when my son was born, Raphael, he said, "A beautiful name. His friends will call him Rafi. The elderly will hear it as Ravi." And so I'm so honored to be your son's namesake. That was Ravi. And
claimed that glory for himself, did he?
Yeah, but this sort of beauty of interpersonal interaction. And just one more thought there. This I learned of just recently, but there was a contract worker who was doing some regular but intermittent work in the building. And we thought that she probably didn't even know Ravi, or wouldn't have known that he was sick. And so not long ago, one of our colleagues went up and communicated to her, that Ravi had this disease and it wasn't looking good. And she just began to sob and had to hold the wall and sort of, collapsed and began to tell this story, and told our colleague that when Ravi first saw her, he walked right up to her and he had somehow managed to learn her name, and he addressed her by name, looked her in the eye, and thanked her for the work that she was doing in the building. And every time they would pass by each other after that, he would greet her by name. Because of that, she came from a different religious tradition. She looked him up online. She started watching the YouTube videos. Her family started watching the YouTube videos. English is not her first language, nor her family's. They said, this is difficult for us to understand. She said, I know it was for me too, but pray to God and ask him for understanding, and you'll be able to understand the videos, and they'll be a blessing to you. And she's now on her journey. But that's something of Ravi. We have amazing stories of someone from 20 years prior who walked up to Ravi and said, you won't remember me. And he addressed the person by name. Someone from 7 years prior, you won't remember me, addressed the person by name. That's really who Ravi is. And it's actually amazing to think, when Ravi always talking about the Grand Weaver, but it's because he was not a good student and his mother was a teacher. People thought that he had a photographic memory, but he didn't. His mother was a teacher and he wasn't a good student, and she went to great lengths to teach him methods of memorization. And look at what that did in his ministry in terms of his memorization of hymns and poems and the scriptures, and also of people's names, which he took such care in.
Have you got any?
And cricket scores as well. So he discovered that my youngest son is a very, very passionate cricket player, plays for our region, and every time he saw him, they would sort of exchange very detailed conversations about cricket, and it connected just brilliantly with young people. One of my fondest memories actually of Ravi is, I think, from either 1999 or 2000, when a small group of us, the ministry was really small then, we're in India together, and he wanted us to go to Calcutta. He wanted us as evangelists to experience the temple of the goddess Kali, the sacrificial system there, and to see, just experience with our eyes and all our senses what it might be like to live in that kind of system. And then he took us to Mother Teresa's home for the dying, and she had died, I think, 2 years previously, but the sisters there knew exactly who he was. And we went into the various rooms there, and just praying and sort of observing as well what was happening. And they were talking about how every person that came sort of brought themselves there in order to die and to have a dignified death, and with the love of Jesus. And we went into a room just filled with cots, with babies and toddlers in these cots. And the sister there was explaining that obviously these children can't bring themselves, but they went to the rubbish dumps every day to rescue children and young people, at which point Ravi and all of us just began to weep. I think his compassion and empathy for the poorest and those who really suffer in this world, it really did. It wasn't just something he talked about, it's something he acted on. It shaped his ministry. He went on to found with his daughter Wellspring International, which is our humanitarian arm, which really looks at that. So that's a side of him that not everybody would necessarily think of, the great intellect, the ideas person, but who passionately cared about the poorest and the deepest issues of suffering in our world.
Yeah.
One story is for me, and one story I just received today from someone who was impacted by Ravi. I'll give the story about me because it's not nearly as exciting, but or as impactful. But I remember, this is a small thing. I remember a lot of things what you learn from Ravi is by osmosis. He doesn't have to tell you. You just are around him and you see it. And one of those things was I was in a hotel room with him. I was in another city with him in a different country other than the US. And he was going to another country that I'd already been to. And I needed to brief him on the meetings he would be having with some of the people I had already spoken to. And as I turned around, I was looking in my bag for some notes that I had. I turned around and he was holding a cup of coffee that he had just made with the cheap sort of, coffee maker in the room. And he says, 1 cream, right? I never told him that. He just observed it and did it. And he made that for me. Like, why did he remember that? I don't know why he remembered that. He just did. It's not a big thing, but it's a small thing. And he treated all the managers of the restaurants we went to, all the managers of the hotels we went to knew his name because he spent time talking to them as if they were the president of the country. Mm-hmm. He just did that. But here's the story I just want to share briefly, and I won't give you the whole detail because it's so much. But there was a man who was speaking with him as part of a trip in Moscow in 2002, and he got the terrible news that from his wife who was 35 weeks pregnant, that an ultrasound had revealed that his unborn daughter had little to no brain tissue development. And rather than just say something like, I'll pray for you, if there's anything we can do, let us know, Ravi launched into in a private meeting all these specific offers to help. He said, I would call my assistant, I'd arrange for a car to get you to the airport and fly you. We have wonderful medical facilities in Atlanta. You can stay in my home. We'll take care of all these things for you. And the man was amazed that Ravi didn't just give a platitude. He actually offered specifically to help in ways that were tangible. And as he wrote to us, he finished his message by saying this, essentially, though he never really got the chance to visit Ravi in his home. He's looking forward to meeting Ravi in heaven. And he said, and I'm looking forward to introducing you to the daughter you so graciously offered to help. So specifically, she's 17 years old now.
Wow. Extraordinary story. There are many stories of a similar nature coming in, and I'm sure you guys will all be reading them and reflecting on them and bringing them together. Obviously, I assume that some kind of commemoration is obviously going to be happening at some point in due course. I mean, just as we start to draw today's show to a close, and there are so many things I'd love to have chatted about, but we haven't had time. I think one thing, Amy, is that Ravi and the ministry really have actually changed the face of Christian apologetics and evangelism in the world. I mean, frankly, what is it that Ravi brought? What changed, and how has that kind of shaped the way that people are now thinking about apologetics and evangelism going forward?
I mean, I think there are quite a few contributions that Ravi's made to the field of apologetics globally. Probably the most important one has been to hold evangelism and apologetics together, to bring apologetics out of the sphere of either the ultra cerebral kind of intense focus on tiny details and into the hands of ordinary people to actually engage with the questions that other ordinary people are asking them and show how the gospel makes sense. So people's questions as a kind of bridge to evangelism. I mean, I really think that he made an enormous contribution, particularly in the 1990s and early 2000s, in the whole area of pluralism, how we understand truth, the exclusivity of truth, the uniqueness of Christ. I think his Indian heritage helped him to do that and to understand how and why a generation were embracing kind of New Age ideology and embracing sort of relativism and pluralism on a massive scale in the West. And I think he was the best person at articulating the Christian faith in that kind of landscape at that moment. I think probably I'll limit it to 3 because let the other guys say as well. But I think probably the other most significant contribution was to locate apologetics in the human search for meaning and to show intellectually as well as practically and through his references to the arts how utterly empty we are without Christ, and how materialism, godless philosophies, technology, economic advancement, none of that is going to answer the cry of the heart. And it's only Jesus who can do that. I don't think the church was very confident pre-Ravi's articulation of that, and actually reaching outwardly successful people who seemed like they had their life together and were fulfilling the American dream, or, a dream of sort of material wealth. But Ravi's gospel message spoke to that cry of the heart, and I think that was a major contribution.
Vince, do you want to give some thought of his contribution as well?
Yeah, I would really just echo to highlight, further something that Amy has said, just that integration of evangelism and apologetics, just so significant. Still sometimes today we'll get invited to a university campus, and we might get invited by a Christian group, and they say, can you do apologetics at lunchtime and then do evangelism in the evening? And we sort of know what's meant by that, but it's almost like asking, can you deal with questions of truth at lunchtime? And then in the evening, can you actually make a shift to loving the person and inviting into relationship? And I think because of the story of Ravi's brokenness, of the way that he encountered truth in that personal way back when he was 17, these things were just so integrated for him. There could be no separation. And that's just so relevant to us today. Ravi understood that God is love and God is truth. God is love. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And if that's the case, then love and truth are actually identified. They're one and the same. If you have love without truth, it's not love. If you have truth without love, it's not truth. Those things were united for Ravi. He found those things united in the person of Jesus, and ultimately at the cross. And he understood his ministry as clearing away the bushes so that we could see clearly to the cross, and just bringing those two things together, love and truth. And I think that has an application not only for Christian ministry and preaching and evangelism, but just culturally right now. We're in a place of a cultural ultimatum that's so often put to us. Are we going to say love is more important than truth and wind up in relativism and pluralism? Or are we going to say that truth is more important than love and wind up in vitriol and polarization? Ravi refused to choose. He resisted that cultural ultimatum because he found love and truth perfectly united in the person of Jesus at the cross.
And any thoughts yourself, Abdu? And especially, I suppose, what do we do now? Ravi isn't with us, I suppose, because there aren't that many Ravis around. He was quite unique in so many ways. And what are your hopes, fears, I suppose, as well for the future, I suppose, of evangelism and apologetics without him as on the team in this lifetime, at least?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. I think if I were to wrap up everything that's already been shared just now on this one question about what Ravi did to contribute to apologetics, I would say this is that oftentimes people, I know the church resists apologetics sometimes because of the division it can bring. You have these people who study their books and they read their articles and they read their doctrine only to make sure that they can email the pastor 15 reasons why your sermon was terrible. They turn apologetics into the art of making someone sorry they asked, as opposed to art and science of Christian persuasion. And Ravi had a way of making it so that you wouldn't bludgeon the other side. You would often extend a hand. He often would say, you present the gospel. And what a wonderful way to put it. So I think that's the contribution. So there's a fear, okay? The immediate fear is that, will there be a Christian statesman like Ravi Zacharias, who can go about and make everyone feel important because they are, who will actually live the truth that he preached. What he preached was every person had inherent and intrinsic dignity that was objectively rooted in the objective source of all dignity, which is God, and then actually live like he believed what he just said. And that's a fear, because if we lose one of our greatest statesmen, one of our greatest ambassadors, can we pick up the mantle? What I would say is the hope we have as the flip side of the coin of that fear is that the answer is going to be yes. We're never going to have a person like Ravi. He's irreplaceable. Every single person on this phone call is irreplaceable. Mm-hmm. Justin, you do things in a way that you do relative to the gifting God has given to you. And Vince does, and Amy does. And he's given us opportunities, and he's woven together the various paths of our lives. I have a degree in psychology, and I have a degree in law, and I'm doing this for a living now. And one could say, what a tremendous waste of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And you think to yourself, but wait a minute, Ravi instilled in me a desire to care for people and the way they think and their hurts and the wounds. That's psychology. And a way to amass argument and evidence. That's law. And you put them together and you have the kind of apologetics Ravi Zacharias actually embodied. So I think that you have a team of 57 full-time speakers. You have 90 plus speakers when you consider adjuncts and others around. And because of the man he was, people like this gravitated towards him, people who wanted to share the truth in love, as Vince so eloquently put, and the transformation of the way apologetics was often viewed and communicated, as Amy so wonderfully explained to us. Those two people are from all over the world were gathered together to want to serve alongside Ravi, not so they could be the next Ravi, but so they could be the next them, but in a Ravi-like way, in a way that showed that people cared. I don't have fear. Honestly, I do not have fear for the future, not certainly of this ministry, not headed by Michael Ramsden, not headed by Sarah Davis, Ravi's daughter, who is the CEO of the ministry, not headed by Amy Orr-Ewing, not headed by Vince Vitale and Max Jaganathan and Andy Wickham and Tanya Walker and all these brilliant people. And I would forget, the names would be too long for me to tell you about. This is the ministry that Ravi had the foresight to want to say, it's not a show.
But and I have witnessed it over the last 20 years, seeing Ravi almost, I think, anticipating this day that it may be called Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, but one day there won't be a Ravi. And what I've seen is him very purposefully bring and mentor young people, especially, to be the next generation of thinkers and evangelists. And I, frankly, haven't really had Ravi on my show, believe it or not, but I've had loads of people that Ravi
that's unbelievable
has it is, isn't it? But I've had so many people on my show at my conferences for whom Ravi has been obviously a father figure, a mentor, and so in that way I feel like I've spoken to all his children in a sort of funny way, and that I think is an enormous testimony in itself, because there are so many ministries, let's face it, which are often built on a sparkling personality, a dynamic person, but which kind of wither and die on the vine afterwards because they can't be sustained. But that I don't get the sense in any way that that's where RZIM is right now. And I'm guessing you guys would all affirm that.
Yeah, we're just really thankful. You know, Ravi for several years has said, I'm not done, but my work is finished. He really felt that sense of gratitude that God had enabled him to build a team, as he felt very specifically called to do so. And we're so thankful that he was obedient to that aspect of his calling, because it would have produced many fewer headaches had he not built a team of 97 speakers. Sure. And every time there's a crisis somewhere, ultimately that lands on your desk. But that has given us the start in our callings that we've been able to have. And we're so thankful for that. And just thinking those words again, suffering produces endurance and produces character and produces hope. And, you know, we've gone through a season now of suffering as a ministry, as we've suffered with Ravi and his family. And Margie, you know, has said several times she really believes that it's going to be through, even as Ravi said on one of the clips that you showed, Justin, through this suffering that the team is going to be bound together in a more deep way than ever before. And interestingly, you know, suffering produces endurance. That word actually, the literal meaning of that word is remaining behind. And I find that very significant, that through the suffering, there's going to be a remaining behind, the remaining behind of a team. And my hope is that that's a team that has a character that we saw modeled in Ravi as Ravi looked to Jesus. And I was so encouraged last year when the most consistent feedback we got on one of our training programs at the Zacharias Institute was people said all of the staff, not only the speakers, but all of the staff knew us by name when we walked in the door. That's something that we've inherited from Ravi. And I think that's why we're going to have a hope that we can continue to share.
Yeah, it's been wonderful to reminisce, to talk and sort of just imagine as well what the future could be like as well, even without Ravi with us. But it's been such a privilege to share this time with you, especially when knowing you guys are so busy at the moment, as you come to terms and obviously deal with all the surrounding interest. For now, God's blessings on you all. We'll be thinking of you, praying for you. Obviously, we will be looking out for those opportunities that I'm sure are coming when we can remember and celebrate Ravi's life and ministry as well in other ways. But for now, Abdu, Vince and Amy, thank you very much for being with me on the show.
Thank you, Justin.
Thank you very much.
Our pleasure.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.